For thousands of years, empires believed they were protected by gods. Rome had Jupiter, Egypt had Ra, the Maya had Kukulkan, and the gods of maize, rain, and time itself. As long as the temples were full, as long as the rituals continued, the empire would stand forever. That was the promise. But history whispers a different truth. The gods do not leave suddenly. They leave quietly. At first, the signs are subtle. A bad harvest, a strange eclipse, a priest's warning ignored. People tell themselves it is nothing, just nature, just coincidence. But doubt is a small crack that grows into a canyon. Because once you believe the gods are displeased, every misfortune feels like a message, and soon the empire begins to listen with fear instead of faith. Across ancient Rome, rumors spread of falling stars and statues bleeding. Birds migrated in the wrong season. The sun looked sick behind red dust. Priests offered sacrifices, but the crowds watching them wondered if anyone was listening above. A nation once proud of its destiny now questioned whether the heavens had turned away. In Egypt, where kings were gods walking in flesh, the first whispers of abandonment were terrifying. The Nile suddenly failed to flood. Crops wilted under merciless Sunday. The Pharaoh prayed at temples where the incense no longer seemed to rise. Priests recorded that the gods no longer spoke in dreams. A kingdom built on divine favor began to feel cursed. And in the deep forests and stone cities of the Maya, temples stood as staircases to the sky. But one day, the sky did not answer. The rains vanished, rivers shrank into dust, and the sacred calendar that predicted everything suddenly predicted nothing. The great cities emptied as if the gods themselves had ordered silence. This is the pattern history hides. Long before the armies fall, long before the borders collapse, the people know something is wrong. They feel it in the soil, in the air, in the trembling voice of the priest who cannot explain why the prayers go unanswered. Faith is the first foundation of empire. And when faith cracks, everything above it begins to fall. The gods do not speak, and so the people fill the silence with fear. Because the most terrifying sign of collapse is not a foreign army. It is the moment a civilization looks to the sky and no longer sees a protector. Rome believed it was chosen, the city of destiny. Fortuna herself favored Roman swords and Roman laws. Every victory proved that the gods stood behind the legions. As long as Jupiter watched from the Capitoline Hill, the empire could never fall. But then the signs changed. It began with whispers in the streets. A comet tearing across the night sky, a lightning strike that split the temple of Jupiter. Statues of the gods toppled by strange winds. Priests called for calm, but fear spread faster than reassurance. Romans had lived through omens before, yet these felt different. There was no triumph that followed, no golden age to balance the dread. The plagues came next, first in distant provinces, then marching toward Rome itself. Bodies piled on the streets, funeral pyres burned without pause. Citizens prayed to every god they knew, but the heavens stayed silent. The empire's enemy suddenly was not a barbarian army, but an invisible curse. If the gods were guardians, why had they opened the gates? The economy cracked. The denarius that once ruled global trade was now a cheap imitation. Silver vanished from the coins. Trust vanished from the people. A currency backed by divine confidence lost both. When money loses value, belief follows. Rome's borders began to bleed. Legions that once crushed kingdoms now struggled to defend a single frontier. They fought for pay, not for glory, and sometimes the pay never arrived. Soldiers deserted. Generals rebelled. Loyalty fractured like a broken mosaic. The emperors tried to force faith back into the world. New gods, new temples, new decrees, claiming divine favor. But no law can command belief. And when the empire asked its citizens to keep pretending everything was fine, the silence of the gods became deafening. By the time Alaric and the Visigoths reached Rome, the collapse had already happened inside the minds of its people. The gods who once crowned Roman victories now watched without lifting a hand. Or perhaps they were never watching at all. The Eternal City discovered a truth every empire eventually learns. Power does not vanish when an enemy arrives. Power vanishes the moment no one believes it is sacred. For Egypt, the gods were not distant figures in the sky. They walked among the people. They breathed through the Nile, burned through the sun, and judged through the Pharaoh, a living god in human form. As long as the Nile flowed and the crops rose, the world made sense. Faith and survival were the same thing. But the river stopped listening. One year, the annual flood arrived late. The next, it barely came at all. The dark, fertile soil that fed millions turned hard and cracked. Farmers stared at their shriveled fields and asked what sin had awakened the wrath of the gods. The priests offered more sacrifices, the temples consumed more grain while the people starved. Then came disasters that felt biblical long before the Bible existed. Locusts that devoured what little grew. Sandstorms that swallowed entire caravans. Strange diseases that spread through cattle and children alike. The empire wrote them down as omens, warnings of cosmic betrayal. Yet the pharaoh insisted he still spoke with the divine. He stood in gold, surrounded by sacred symbols, claiming that the gods would restore order. But outside the palace walls, belief was crumbling. When the gods no longer answered prayers, the king who claimed their favor became a liar in the eyes of his own people. Rebellions ignited in the south. Foreign armies pressed from the north and east. Egypt's bureaucracy, once a marvel of the ancient world, collapsed under hunger and fear. When people no longer believe their ruler is divine, they no longer obey. And a kingdom built on eternal order suddenly fell to chaos. The elite clung to rituals. They poured treasure into tombs and temples, desperately trying to bribe the gods back into loyalty. But gold cannot buy what faith has already lost. Every unopened grain silo, every corpse laid in an unblessed grave, whispered the same terrifying truth. The gods had walked away. Or worse, perhaps the gods had never been there at all. Perhaps it was human hands that made them powerful, and human doubt that made them disappear. In Egypt, collapse did not begin with invasion. It began with silence, a silence that echoed louder than thunder. The Maya lived by the sky. Every sunrise, every eclipse, every movement of Venus marked the calendar of gods and kings. Their astronomers measured the heavens with a precision the modern world still marvels at. To the Maya, the cosmos was not random, it was a conversation. Then suddenly, the sky had no answers. The rains failed first. Not for a season, but for years. Crops withered before fruiting, rivers shrank into cracked ravines. The sacred cenotes that once reflected the stars turned black and dry. The gods who controlled time and rain, the twin lifelines of the Maya, had vanished from the world they created. Fear crept into the temples. Priests turned desperate. They performed greater rituals, darker offerings. They carved warnings into stone, disasters unfolding faster than they could appease the heavens. The rulers responded with towering pyramids, monuments built not for glory but for forgiveness, as if height alone could reach a distant god. But the silence only grew heavier. People began leaving the great cities, Tikal, Palenque, Copan, not with the chaos of invasion or plague. They left like worshippers drifting away from a temple that no longer speaks. House by house, village by village, a quiet exodus, like a candle burning down to nothing. Without faith, kings lost their right to rule. Without kings, cities lost the will to stand. Walls cracked, markets emptied. Jade and obsidian lost all value when the gods no longer blessed the trade. A civilization that once mapped the universe now collapsed into a darkness no star chart could predict. Archaeologists search for simple explanations. Drought, war, disease, all true but incomplete. The Maya did not just lose resources, they lost purpose. The empire did not fall because people died. It fell because people stopped believing. When an entire civilization looks to the heavens for guidance and sees only endless, uncaring blue, the heart of that civilization breaks. The Maya listened for the gods, and the gods answered with silence. Not a roar, not a warning, just silence and abandonment. The Aztec Empire rose like a fire in the Valley of Mexico, fierce, fast, unstoppable. They believed the sun itself was their partner in conquest. Every battle won, every city taken, every heart sacrificed, all of it was fuel to keep the universe alive. The sun needed warriors. The empire provided them. But a system built on blood can survive only as long as fear outweighs doubt. And doubt arrived wearing armor. When the Spanish ships breached the horizon in 1519, the Aztecs were not ignorant. They were terrified, not of the men stepping ashore, but of what they meant. Prophecies warned of a god with pale skin returning from the east. Dates aligned, omens multiplied. A comet streaked across the skies. The temples echoed with trembling prayers. Moctezuma, emperor of the Aztecs, did not act like a ruler meeting soldiers. He acted like a believer confronting destiny. He hesitated. He questioned the gods. And in that hesitation, the empire cracked. The Spanish did not conquer with steel alone. They conquered with uncertainty. Smallpox ravaged the capital, but it was spiritual infection that struck first. Warriors who once believed their deaths fed the sun now wondered whether their gods had been lying all along. Tenochtitlan, Built like Venice with canals and shimmering temples transformed into a silent battlefield. Priests begged the gods for a sign. Captives once destined for sacrifice lay untouched, because no one knew if the rituals still mattered. The greatest empire in the Americas lost faith faster than it lost territory. When the final assault came, the Aztec warriors fought not with confidence, but with fear that the gods had walked away. The result was not just defeat, it was erasure. Books burned, temples collapsed, names forgotten except through the words of their conquerors. The Aztec Empire did not fall because the Spanish were strong. It fell because the Aztecs realized the sun did not shine for them anymore. Once belief dies, the body of a civilization soon follows. Babylon was once the jewel of the ancient world walls so high they defied imagination, gardens said to hang from the heavens themselves. Kings ruled by divine right, recorded on clay tablets as chosen by Marduk, the great god of order and kingship. As long as Marduk remained in his temple, no conqueror could threaten the city. But gods can leave without warning. In the final years of Babylon's power, omens multiplied. Astronomers, the most respected scholars of the age, tracked the skies with fear. Eclipses arrived at the wrong time. Sacred constellations dimmed. Priests declared emergency rituals, but every sacrifice felt like a question with no answer. King Nabonidus made a fatal mistake. He began ignoring Marduk, promoting a different god instead. He left Babylon for years, abandoning the capital while he chased religious visions in the desert. The people watched their king turn away from their protector, and they followed. Faith did not collapse suddenly. It quietly dissolved. When Cyrus of Persia approached the city, no grand battle erupted. The mighty walls remained unbreached. The soldiers kept their weapons. But the will to resist the belief that Babylon was eternal had already died. The Persians diverted the river, marched into the city, and seized it in a single night. Clay records state that the people welcomed them, hoping Cyrus would respect the gods more than their own king had. Babylon was not destroyed by force. It surrendered because the heavens no longer seemed to care. Temples still stood. Priests still chanted. But every word carried the weight of a broken covenant. The gods who once made Babylon invincible had abandoned it, or perhaps Babylon abandoned its gods first. Standing among the ruins today, you don't see shattered walls or burned monuments. You feel a different kind of emptiness, the kind that comes when belief itself has turned to dust. The world remembers Babylon as a fallen empire. But in truth, Babylon simply stopped believing it deserved to rise. The Ottoman Empire once claimed to be the sword of Islam, the guardian of Mecca and Medina, the shadow of God on earth. Sultans marched with the certainty that heaven itself followed at their side. Victories stretching from Arabia to the gates of Vienna felt like confirmation of divine favor. But power changes faith. Slowly, worship gave way to ritual. Ritual faded into habit, and habit slipped into emptiness. For centuries, Friday prayers in Istanbul thundered with chants thanking God for conquest and prosperity. But by the 1800s, those prayers took on a different tone, trembling with fear. Imams begged for protection against enemies who seemed to appear from every direction at once. Reformers insisted the empire must modernize. Traditionalists accused them of betraying the sacred order. The army fractured into factions, each claiming God stood behind them. When everyone insists heaven speaks through them alone, heaven stops speaking to anyone. Then came a sign. The Ottomans could not ignore. God's house was burning. In 1918, the empire lost Jerusalem. Where once Ottoman banners waved above the holiest places, foreign troops marched through ancient gates as if they were walking into a museum. Millions across the Muslim world gasped, how could the Sultan lose the city of prophets? Was this a military defeat? Or the final confirmation that the divine mantle had been withdrawn? The empire didn't collapse in a single battle. It unraveled in silence, province by province, belief by belief. When the Caliphate was abolished in 1924, it felt like watching the soul of a 1,000-year power dissolve into thin air. No fire, no thunder, just quiet. A subtle but devastating realization. The blessing was gone, and without it, the empire had nothing left to offer its people. The Maya built cities that defied the jungle pyramids, scraping the clouds, observatories aligned with the path of Venus, temples carved with the faces of gods who demanded perfection. Their priests could predict eclipses with stunning precision. Time itself felt like something they controlled. But knowledge can become a prison. The Maya believed their rituals kept the universe in balance. If a priest misread the stars, if a ceremony was delayed, if a sacrifice fell short, the world might fall into chaos. Every drought, every disease, every unexplained shift in the wind became a terrifying question. What if the gods were displeased? The 9th century brought a silence the Maya could not explain. Rain stopped falling, cornfields shriveled. The sacred cenotes dried into cracked earth. Priests performed every ritual they knew, but the skies did not respond. For generations, the Maya had lived with a secure belief: the gods speak, and we answer. But suddenly, the gods were silent. No voices in the temples, no signs in the stars. Trust in the priesthood evaporated. City-states turned on each other. Trade routes snapped. Elite families fled their monuments and vanished into the forests. There was no foreign invasion, no vast army at the gates, only doubt spreading like a disease. Temples crumbled not from war, but from abandonment. The jungle reclaimed stone once worshipped as the center of the cosmos. Imagine living in that moment, watching the calendar that had guided your ancestors for centuries fail to predict the future. Watching your leaders insist the gods still cared, while every sign said otherwise. The Maya collapse was not a battle. It was a breaking of trust between humanity and the heavens. And once that trust was gone, the greatest cities of the New World became ghost stories swallowed by vines. Rome did not fall because the legions forgot how to fight. It fell because the empire forgot what it believed. For centuries, the Romans saw victory as proof that their gods favored them. Every conquest fed the divine order, temples multiplied, festivals never ended. Rome convinced itself that the universe was Roman by design. But as the empire grew richer, the gods grew quieter. Priests performed rituals they no longer understood. Emperors declared themselves divine to fill the spiritual vacuum. Citizens prayed not for virtue or victory, but for bread, gambling, luck, and the next spectacle in the arena. When plagues swept the empire, the old gods offered no answers. When inflation devoured wealth, sacrifices achieved nothing. When enemies crossed the frontiers, Jupiter stayed silent. So Rome looked for new gods, then newer ones. Then, any belief that promised safety. By the 4th century, the temples stood half empty. The empire wasn't sure who protected it anymore, or if anyone did, and the people felt it. Not long after, Alaric's Visigoths marched toward Rome. The city still possessed walls, soldiers, and treasure, but it no longer possessed the certainty that had carried it for 800 years. The Romans assumed the city could not fall. The gods had other plans. When the gates opened from within and the sack began, it wasn't just buildings that burned. It was the mythology of Rome's immortality. Citizens realized the truth all collapsing empires learn. Power is lost the moment people believe it can be lost. Faith goes first. Armies follow. Rome tried to buy time, bribing invading armies with gold, paying soldiers with promises, inventing comforting lies about destiny, but the bill always comes due. You cannot pay off a god who has already turned away. Every empire believes one thing, that its story ends differently. Egypt believed the Nile would always rise. Rome believed the eagles would always return victorious. The Maya believed the heavens would always speak. But what happens when nature stops cooperating? When victories stop arriving? When the heavens go silent? Collapse is not just political or economic. Collapse is spiritual. The final stage begins when people look to the sky for answers and find nothing. Egypt felt this in its last gasps. The harvest failed. The priesthood's rituals no longer brought floods. Pharaohs, once living gods, became powerless kings. When the plagues came, the people wondered aloud whether the gods had abandoned them entirely. In the Maya world, kings claimed cosmic authority. They built temples aligned perfectly with the stars. They predicted the rains, the seasons, the cycles of the universe. But when drought struck year after year, the predictions failed. The kings lost their divine mandate. Cities emptied. The jungle swallowed their pride. Rome felt it too. For centuries, religion was a military alliance with the divine. As long as Rome conquered, the gods were loyal. But when defeat mounted, when disease spread, even the emperor's prayers found only silence. So the people turned inward. They trusted rumors, cults, superstitions. They believed in anything except Rome. That is the moment every empire fears. When citizens stop believing that tomorrow will be better than today. No government survives that loss of faith. No army can fight without purpose. No currency holds value when trust evaporates. Empires are not destroyed by enemies. They are abandoned by the heavens first, and by their own people second. The moment the sky goes quiet, the end has already begun.